Ladies and gentlemen, you're all very, very welcome here to the Seven Oaks Hotel for our February lecture. And this evening it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Andy Bielenberg and his wife Linda, who've come up to us today from Cork. Not a very easy journey this afternoon and evening because the weather is not so kind. And but thank you to them for making the journey up in terrible conditions, and to you all for coming here this evening to hear the lecture. Dr. Bielenberg is a historian and an author on Irish social, economic and revolutionary history. He has recently retired as a lecturer of economics in University College Cork, and he has published on Irish economic and social history. His books include The Shannon Scheme and the Electrification of the Irish Free State, and Irish Flour Milling, A 1,000-Year History. Also, Locke's Distillery, A History, and An Economic History of Ireland Since Independence. He has worked on the Atlas of the Irish Civil War, which I'm sure some of you would have seen. It's a rather large volume, which he will refer to in the presentation this evening. So without further ado, I have great pleasure in introducing Dr. Andy Bielenberg.
Good evening, everybody, and great that you could all come on such a horrible night. I do have some connections with Carlow County because my grandparents lived near Tullow, County Carlow. It was actually Coolkenna, which is actually in County Wicklow, but it's got a Carlow address for some strange factor of postal history, which is lost on me. First of all, thank you to the Society, to Richard, to Paul, and no doubt to other members for the invitation to talk to you tonight. And I'm very glad to be here and to share some of my findings, and our findings, I should say. My talk tonight is really based on a project funded by Arts, the Gaeltacht, Sports and Media. I think it's actually changed again since then, but so I'm delighted to get the chance to share some of our findings with you here tonight. Now, it's often said that civil war is simply politics by other means. At the last general election in the Republic, the three largest parties, which took the great bulk of the votes, can all trace their Republican origins back to pre-treaty Sinn Féin. In short, today, Irish elections over a century after the Civil War are still largely about which descendant or descendants of pre-treaty Sinn Féin should govern the country. So I think that fact alone shows how important it is today that we continue to strive to understand the Irish Civil War. Because if you want to understand Irish politics, you've got to understand the Civil War and what that was about and what that came out of. Now, to start with, maybe I should give you some background to this project and how it came about. I'm actually an economic historian over many years, but during the decade of centenaries, like many other people, many here probably among you, I was drawn into the study of war and revolution and the revolutionary years. And I was involved in constructing a fatality register for County Cork over the period of the revolution. That was quite a job because there were over 800 fatalities in County Cork. So that kept me off the streets for some years. And I did this with Professor Jim Donnelly in the University of Wisconsin. But the problem was our findings were the number of words generated out of this project, because we provided a bio for each fatality. It ran to 300,000, 400,000 words, and no one would publish it. So we had to go online, and that's the background to the Cork Fatality Register. Now, actually what we found is being online was great because lots of people could read it for free. And secondly, if you get something wrong, and the public complain that this is wrong and that's wrong, and my family wasn't there, and we were able to correct it. So that's a great thing about digital, having a digital repository is you can change it when there's a mistake. You simply change it. So maybe that's the way things are going to go in the future. Now, I suppose the thing about that project was that was a kind of apprenticeship, if you like, because it showed us how to do it, but it also, perhaps more importantly, it showed us what not to do. So what we learned from that was, don't write up a bio for all the families, because then you'll end up in a row with every family that was involved. Just get the bare details. Where the person died, what was their affiliation, were they National Army, IRA, civilian, what was the circumstances of death, that'll be about a sentence, that was the biggest part of it, the date of death, the place of death, the age, occupation, and that was it. So by taking that approach, we could fast track the thing quickly. This had to be done in a very short time frame. We had to operate with a very limited time frame. So one or two things we might have got wrong, but this is a public engagement project. We're well prepared to change anything that's not correct. But I think we pretty well got most of it right. There must be a few more out there that we didn't get. I'm sure that there must be some, but I don't think there's too many. But it's likely that there is one or two. So we started off on a county level. Cork was already in the bag. So we did a 2-month project doing Munster, which was an important province for the Civil War. So we got Munster done. Luckily for Munster, a lot of the counties historians had done county histories, which included the dead of the Civil War. But let's talk about sources, maybe, if we could. Thanks, Paul. Well, first of all, we got Munster in the bag, and then I was able to hire a guy who you might know, John Dorney, he's an expert on the Civil War, but particularly in Dublin. So John Dorney brought with him all the deaths for County Dublin. Now that was a big one. That was the county with the biggest number of deaths in absolute terms. So that was like getting Lionel Messi into your football team as centre forward. That was okay. I'll keep going anyway while Paul is trying to fix that. So John Dorney was hired as a full-time researcher, and we got a coordinator, Helene O'Keefe, and she provided a liaison with the cartography department. These are the guys who made the maps and the diagrams. And so we had a team now, and we had to put this together within about a year to do the research. So from A to Z, we had to do all this within a year, because we had to get it over before the decade of centenaries was closed. So that was the limitation, okay? So you could spend 10 years doing it, but we did it in one. Okay? Now, so if we just go back, could I go back down? Paul, thanks. So, first of all, let's talk about sources. As you know, historians are obsessed with sources. What sources can you use to put this together? I've mentioned the county histories. They're not all done. I believe Carlow is still on the way. I think one of your members is...
Power, yeah. This for power.
He's working on it. So that was a help in many counties. But the military service pension files, which is a very important source. And so it's only really become possible to do this kind of research in recent years. The military archives have put all the National Army and the pensions of the anti-treaty IRA also up on this side. Now, they're not all up there, but quite a lot of them are. Most of those who died have now been put up there. So that was a very important source. We looked at newspapers, the Irish Independent, the Irish Times, Cork Examiner, a paper in Derry and Belfast. So that was important. Post-truce compensation claims, both for the Irish government and the British government. We were able to find a few in compensation claims. And so with these sources, we also used Republican memorials, commemoration. The last post, which was done way back in 1927. So that was useful. But a lot more Republican monuments have been put up since then, or being put up very recently. We didn't cover the whole country there. There might be a few more out there, certainly, that we missed. But pulling all this stuff together, then we built up Excel files on a county by county basis. Every county had an Excel file, and that was built into a provincial database, and then finally a national database. And the maps, the cartographer had to plot each death, the location, using our information on place, usually a townland or a street in a town, and he had to plot that digitally so that would be represented on a map. And of course, the Geography Department had pioneered these methodologies, the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, the Atlas of the Famine. They were very, very innovative in producing these beautiful atlases. So if I could see the next one, Paul. So basically, with this national database, we could now come up with a headline figure. Maybe if I put on my glasses, I could even see from here. So you can see there that 26 counties was 1425, 648 pro-treaty, 438 anti-treaty, and 335 civilians. So that's what we were able to capture using the methods that we used. That was the number that we were able to pull together and build this national database. So I suppose first of all, maybe, okay, there's also 4 members of Crown Forces. This was the 26 counties. We've got to remember the Northern Ireland, 6 counties in Northern Ireland, only 59, I think, or so in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland was far more quiet. It had been a lot more deaths in Northern Ireland, sectarian killings in Belfast, 1921, 22. But by the Civil War, when the Civil War opened, the North was actually the quietest area on the island. A few killings continued in Belfast, but it was relatively small. So we focus more then on the 26 counties because that's what the Civil War was basically about. Who was to control this state? And this is where the Civil War was largely fought. We were going to just do the 26 counties, but then we had complaints from various quarters. So we did actually respond to criticism, and we went for the full Monty, shall we say, for the whole 32 counties, and included the north. But the pattern in the north was fundamentally different to the south. In the north, it was largely civilians who were killed. In the south, in contrast, combatants accounted for 3/4 of the deaths. So a very different pattern, north and south, and very different contexts as a result of partition and what was going on north and south of the border. So basically, having got all this data, we probably won the contract from Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht because we constructed a list of almost all of those who died. And of course, that was attractive to the government for the decade of centenaries. But we wanted to take it a step further. And once you had all this data, what we wanted to do was to analyze it, to use computers, to draw up tables, to look at what this can tell us about the Civil War. Can we learn anything new about the Civil War from all of this data? These are only people who died, okay? That's how you get on this database. Only people who died. If we could take it on to the next one. Now, first of all, one of the key things we can find from this data is the timing of deaths, okay, during the course of the Civil War. So you can see there's a major peak at the beginning, right, down to, say, August, into September, even, well into September. A lot of the deaths are in this period, particularly for the National Army. The National Army gets hammered in what's called the conventional phase. Historians call the conventional phase the first few months when you actually had combat, open combat, and the anti-treaty side were trying to defend fixed positions. So it was more like conventional warfare as opposed to guerrilla warfare. So you can see the National Army suffers a lot more casualties for quite a lot of the Civil War, and it's really, even right down to the end, the National Army is suffering more. So that's a big question. Why is the National Army, the army of the state, which is much better armed, why is it suffering much more casualties than the anti-treaty side? Well, offensive action militarily is often more costly than defensive action and retreat. Often the anti-treaty side, because it had far less resources, far less arms, it couldn't get involved in long-term battles, and it was often retreating in the face of the resources that the National Army had. But the problem with that was, with defensive action, is more people get killed. Okay, so that's one factor. The other thing is that if you have loads of guns, like in the United States, for example, today, if you have loads of military cars and so forth, lorries, you're going to have accidents. And huge numbers died of accidents. About 1/3 of the National Army died in accidents. This was weapons being discharged, explosives accidents, accidents with machinery, trucks, all kinds of accidents. So 1/3 of fatalities in the National Army were due to accidents, which is a staggering figure. And of course, the anti-treaty side, because they had less weapons, less munitions, they didn't have as many cars and so on, they had less accidents, so less casualties on that side. Now, when matters exploded into open warfare on the 28th of June 1922, from then to the end of August, this really marks the peak for fatalities. The Battle of Dublin, which were the dramatic kind of beginning of the Civil War, in the first week in Dublin alone, something like 70 people are killed. So that's one of the most fatal confrontations in terms of the number of fatalities. But the National Army quickly subdued resistance in Dublin, and the primary theatre of the conflict then switched to Munster. Now, of course, that was a far more difficult assignment for the National Army. The province constituted a major stronghold of the anti-treaty IRA, and of course, much of the leadership of the IRA came out of Munster on both sides, but particularly on the anti-treaty side. So the great majority of the Munster IRA had opposed the treaty from the outset. So crushing opposition in Munster was a paramount military objective for the National Army to consolidate the authority of the new regime. So this was a formidable task at the time, and certainly at the beginning, for the Battle of Limerick, things were far from certain as to what way things would go. But when it came to it, the anti-treaty side suffered major defeats in the short-lived battles for Limerick and Waterford, which both fell into pro-treaty hands on the 21st of July 1921. This quickly and starkly revealed that the anti-treaty side couldn't defend fixed positions. It couldn't deal with artillery in particular. And of course, the National Army had artillery, not superior artillery, it had artillery, with the help of the British government. And of course, they had gunners with experience from the First World War. And basically, the anti-treaty side had no answer to that, and it had to retreat in the face when it was faced with artillery. And many of the Munster towns in between Limerick and Waterford also quickly folded, and the anti-treaty side had to retreat further into its heartlands in Cork and Kerry in particular. And again here, the superior military leadership deployed by the National Army also began to surface during a series of amphibious landings between Kerry and Cork. And the problem for the anti-treaty side is that this opened up many new fronts. They weren't just fighting on one front, they were fighting on multiple fronts. And it never really came to grips with that. And of course, one of the big advantages of going to sea, and this idea came from Dalton, was that the anti-treaty IRA couldn't do anything at sea. They didn't have any boats or ships. So the only thing they could do was defence at the point of landing. And since that was in the hands of the National Army, they couldn't really defend the Munster coastline. It was just simply too great. And the National Army struggled to cope with that. And with the landings in Passage and Feenit and the battle for Limerick and Waterford, these were collectively the most lethal confrontations, military engagements during the Civil War in Munster in terms of overall lives lost. And of course, they all occurred again during this conventional phase that we're talking about. All of these major battles all took place, and you can see the results of that in terms of fatalities overall. And what's interesting is the anti-treaty side didn't even attempt to defend Cork City. Once they lost out in Passage and Rochestown, they began to retreat chaotically from the city. They burnt the barracks, and Cork City was relatively easy to take for the National Army. And Dalton entered the city with the National Army on the 9th of August 1922. So maybe at this stage, the anti-treaty side had learnt the futility of resistance in urban contexts against artillery. And of course, that was a great relief to the citizens of Cork City. The city wasn't going to be despoiled and like Limerick and Waterford and Dublin. But also from an anti-treaty perspective, it meant that they saved resources, they saved men to fight another day in circumstances where the odds were not so heavily stacked against them. Now, while it is often being assumed that the end of the conventional phase of the fighting in August 1922 marked the end of major combat, our figures tell a very different story. Fatalities remained high in the autumn and early winter of 1922, as the IRA, having been driven from fixed positions, which it could not defend, now resorted to more familiar guerrilla tactics from the War of Independence period, notably in places and contexts where it was impossible to deploy artillery. So they receded into the countryside. So while the National Army definitely had the upper hand in the big towns and cities, all of which had been captured by the end of August, in the countryside, the writ of the new state was still uncertain. And the anti-treaty side still had advantages in certain areas. But then the other thing that's worth noting is that the period from the beginning of the conflict and down to the end of November, this period accounted for 2/3 of National Army fatalities. So these early months, a third in the conventional phase, and by the end of November, 2/3 of the National Army deaths had taken place already at this point. So this was enormously costly in terms of lives lost to the National Army. So really it was very much in this context that Mulcahy and O'Higgins introduced the Emergency Powers Bill before the Dáil in late September 1922 to enable the National Army to more easily confront the kind of resistance it faced. And what you've got to remember is civil law had effectively broken down. It was early days for the new state, at the genesis of the new state. The law had hardly become established. And the National Army was handed responsibility at a time when the state was not fully constituted from a legal perspective. And it was given, the army was given exceptional legal powers and execution, both official, legal executions where people were shot in front of a firing squad, but also unofficial executions. We must remember that there were as many unofficial executions where people were shot in prisons, not in front of a firing squad, or the edge of roads and up mountains. And many Republicans were shot in these ways. So the National Army started to resort to execution. There were 77 official executions, a few more if you add in. There were some National Army guys who were also executed for providing weapons to the Republicans. But many of these unofficial executions, this became a new tactic, and it was a form of terror to take on the Republicans, which I think was probably fairly intimidating and effective. And the other weapon that the state used was incarceration. The numbers in jail, there were huge numbers incarcerated, Republicans who were put in jail. Much more than double the amount of people were incarcerated by the National Army than by the British during the War of Independence. And that certainly was a very effective weapon against the anti-treaty side. And of course, the threat of execution once you're in jail was also something that had an effect towards the end in terms of Republican morale. And this fairly atrocious legal situation was justified by the state, by the authorities, on the grounds that this was absolutely necessary to achieve law and order and to secure the very survival of the state. This was the argument that was made by the government at the time. And certainly from the birth of the state to the present day, this was most certainly the most sordid chapter in Irish legal history, and it remained a core and bitter focus of Republican memory of the conflict, long after the conflict was over. But of course, the National Army did not have a monopoly on violence. And as I pointed out, far more National Army soldiers were killed in the conflict. But the power of the state did give the National Army a huge advantage, not least because they were paid. It was a paid army. There's a big difference between a paid army and an army that has to survive off the land. And also, it was far better armed and equipped with a lot of help from the British side on that front. Now, National Army losses began to fall then from the late autumn and winter of 1922, and the new regime could point to this as a justification for this more oppressive approach. The growing Free State Army, the numbers, the recruitment went up and up in this period. Of course, this was a period of depression, economic depression. So the incentive to sign up for the National Army was very strong, both in the north and in the south. In the north, more people died in the south of Ireland from Northern Ireland than in the north of Ireland. But most of those were in the National Army, not on the Republican side, which is interesting, given the nature of the treaty which excluded Northern Ireland. And that indicates, in my view, an economic motive for signing up in the first place. It was more to do with economics than politics. Now, the fact that executions increased as overall violence declined reflected two important new developments. Firstly, the Republicans had switched to non-combat tactics, burning the houses of Free State supporters, the destruction of the communications infrastructure. So the new strategy was to make the state so ungovernable that it wouldn't survive, and a new situation would emerge. And it must be said they had a lot of success in that regard. The railway sector in the county I'm from, County Cork, there were 6 railway companies. The whole lot of them were out of action. All the bridges were down. None of the trains were running. You could maybe get a train north of Mallow to Dublin, but the links up after that were very, very limited. So, on the other hand, the Free State governments need to bring the war to a speedy conclusion before it bankrupted the state. That drove many of the more repressive measures which began to increase particularly in the latter stages of the Civil War. If I could have the next one. Now, this map, I don't know, I don't know if you can see that, but this map crystallizes all our work. And really, in this map, each death is represented by one dot, okay? According to your affiliation, civilians are green, and the Irish Republican Army is red, and the National Army is the darker colour. So really, in this map, you can see the geography of death in the Civil War. You can see where the deaths took place. Now, our approach was to list each death in the place where each person died. Okay, the point of death, where they died, that's where they're on this map. And you could do it a different way. You could look at the geography of violence. You could look at where people were wounded, and that map would look slightly different. It would maybe be a bit more dispersed, maybe a little bit more rural, because people got wounded and they were shipped by rail back to wherever the hospitals were. So this map, basically, a lot of people died, they were wounded, they were half dead, they were carted on a train to the hospital, both hospitals locally, also hospitals in the garrison towns, the old British Army towns had hospitals. Dublin, of course, dominated the Curragh, you can see here. So a lot of people died in hospitals, but also in prisons. So the garrison towns also had the prisons. Dublin, Cork, Tralee is a garrison town, Limerick. So you can see the concentrations around there, as well as the battles of Limerick, Tralee, Cork, Waterford, and Dublin. They all add to the concentrations in those areas. But you can see outside of these centres, you can see this area here, Sligo, Mayo, Wexford, Louth. These were all areas where the anti-treaty IRA was strong. Where the anti-treaty IRA was strong, then you get a centre of resistance. And that's where the confrontations and deaths take place also. In other areas which are pro-treaty, say Longford, Clare, there tends to be less deaths, less confrontation, were so-called quiet counties. So you can see the death zones really centre on the major cities. If we go on to the next. Now, if we look at this a different way, right? Now, Cork is the biggest county in Ireland with the biggest population. Dublin has got a huge population. So that's going to inflate the number of casualties in those places. If we adjust for population, Kerry is a much smaller population, And we adjust by the number of deaths per 1,000 persons, so that you even everything up in terms of this map. This map represents an adjustment for population. So pro rata, the number of deaths per 1,000, that's what's on this. So you can see Kerry stands out as by far the most violent county in Ireland. It's more than double the next county. Kerry was by far the most violent county in Ireland. And that's because anti-treaty resistance was strongest in Kerry. It was the hardest county to subdue. The National Army was still struggling to subdue resistance in Kerry right down until the end. And if we carry on to the next one, again we can see some of the big differences if we look at the county by affiliation. This map represents the number killed from each county. It's not place, but from. So everyone who died from Kerry anywhere is here. Anybody from Dublin who died anywhere in Ireland is here in this. So you can see the National Army is far bigger in Dublin. Much more people in Dublin who fought in the Civil War were in the National Army. In Kerry, it's the opposite. It's the Republicans who dominated in Kerry. And of course, all of these people in the National Army, a number of them had fought in the British Army during the First World War. And this is where a new term entered the Irish lexicon, Jackeens. These are Dubliners who fought under the Union Jack. And this was particularly strong in Kerry. And of course, that lived on, particularly in GAA confrontations between the two counties. But that's where that terminology comes from. It comes from, it's some verbal archaeology, if you like, from the Civil War, which lived on in language. Now, if we go on to the next one, and we look at the nature of death, we can see that the vast majority of deaths were inflicted by gunshot, rifles, revolvers, machine guns, but explosives, mostly in the form of improvised explosives or mines, and to a lesser extent, grenades, also featured. And although small in number, these incidents involving mines or explosive devices were very controversial. Trap mines, the Republicans used trap mines, which killed in one go, could kill in some cases 6 National Army soldiers, I think, died in near Macroom in one of these trap mine explosions. And this enraged the National Army troops, and it tended to set off reprisals, where some of the worst reprisals in Kerry again. There was a series of reprisals in Kerry where prisoners were tied to mines, Ballyseedy, Knocknagoshel, probably the worst atrocities of the Civil War. And again, Kerry stands out because the National Army leadership in Kerry, in this instance, actually ordered these atrocities at the time. The guy who was leading at the time, his name escapes me, he was in the Dublin Guard. And this is another reason why opposition in Kerry hardened, and even after the Civil War, the electoral results in Kerry, the Republicans scored very, very high in Kerry. And this was because of civilian resistance, which was so strong in that county relative to the rest of Ireland. Now, I've already gone into accidents, which took such a high toll with the National Army. But I want to illustrate some of the wider findings. I'm going to focus a little more closely on fatalities in Carlow, okay? Where we were able to identify 8 fatalities. There may be more out there that we haven't found, and I'd love to get help from you if you can help me. And the first one was a guy called Joseph Sweeney, a labourer, age 20, who was shot and died. He was shot in Kildare, but he died in the infirmary in Carlow. And we're not sure if he's a Republican or National Army. So can any of you help me with that one? He may not come from Carlow, but that's one we still have to sort out. So as you can see, it's a work in progress, all of this. We've done our best. We're going to have to amend a few, and online we're going to put up additions. Maybe we've got 4 or 5 additional ones from the public since, and we'll put those up, or any corrections. We're going to put that up on the online site, the UCC website. The second one was better known Andrew Baker, age 6, a civilian who found a bomb which was detonated accidentally. And this little 6-year-old child was one of many child victims of the Civil War. Frequently, children playing in the streets got killed in various accidents, but this was a particularly horrific one. This was in Bagnallstown. A group of children came across a mine, and it was detonated, and this child died in hospital on the 17th of July, 1922. And it was all covered up by the authorities. There was no compensation for the parents for years, and the state even denied that it had ever happened. And it was only really subsequently, from the 1960s, that it was gradually exposed what had actually happened in Bagnallstown. So you can see each fatality is not just a dot on the map or a statistic. Each fatality has a tragic family story attached to it. The next is James Hunt of the National Army, age 22, a mechanic. He died in the county infirmary on the 28th of the 10th, 22, from wounds received at the Graney ambush some days before. Miles Carroll, age 26, IRA, was killed in an engagement with the National Army near Michael on the 5th of the 12th, 22. John Farrell, 27, of the National Army, died in Carlow military barracks from the accidental discharge of his own rifle. So you can see here, this guy has had an accident with his own rifle. He's playing around with the rifle, goes off, he gets killed. So you can see a lot of these deaths fit into this wider pattern that I've been talking about. Edward Snoddy, a railway porter, was shot dead in a raid on a house by the owner at Palatine on the 5th of the 1st, 23. He'd escaped from prison. He was raiding a house and he got shot dead by the owner. James Lillis, age 22, a flour mill worker in the IRA, executed in Carlow jail on the 15th of the 1st, 23. And finally, Charles Byrne, 23, IRA, a teacher, who was accidentally shot near Ballymurphy when the gun in his pocket went off while he was evading arrest by the National Army. So you can see in Carlow, half the deaths were in confrontations. 3 of them were accidental. 1 was a civilian, and 1 was an execution. So broadly speaking, it conforms to some of the wider patterns I've been talking about. Most of the victims were very young men. Now, turning to civilian fatalities, civilian fatalities broadly followed the contours of military engagement. They got killed in crossfire. Are we going the right direction? Oh yeah, can we it sort of be? Oh yeah, that's the one. So this is the kind of episode. The picture, I think, makes my case perfectly. There's a full-scale battle going on here. This is better than the movies. All the public here is all lined up there, watching what's going on, following it all. And of course, this is totally dangerous. There's bullets flying everywhere, and people get killed invariably. And of course, this happened all over Ireland. Civilians got killed, children who were outside. And of course, children at this time, you've got to remember they have huge households, big families. So the children are all thrown out in the street during the day to get rid of them. So the houses can be cleaned and get them out from under your feet. So the children are always on the street, and a lot of them, well, not a lot, but quite a lot of accidents where children are run down by army trucks, or like the case I talked about in Bagnallstown. Most of the deaths in Northern Ireland were civilians. In Belfast, so North and South at least shared one thing, the urban focus. You can see more of the civilian deaths are in urban context. Now, if we move on to the next one, previous employment, and we look at the background of victims. And what we found here was very interesting, because Fianna Fáil has always sold the idea that the anti-treaty side were the men of no property. Okay? So let's just unpack that a little bit here from what we found. Now, we've only looked at dead people. To do this really well, you probably need a bigger sample, but this is 1,500 people, so it gives you some idea. So you can see the pro-treaty forces here, unskilled. See the blue on the right-hand side. Unskilled agricultural, also more blue. Blue is higher. Farming families, anti-treaty side, more farmers. So actually, and when we look at professional, more anti-treaty than National Army. So it's the unskilled working class that's fighting in the National Army. The Jackeens, so-called, are the Dublin working class. And this idea that the men of no property, anti-treaty IRA, a lot of those were fighting, they could afford to fight without pay. If you were poor, you couldn't afford to fight with the IRA. You'd have to be supported. And so actually the anti-treaty side had more property and were better off in occupational terms than the National Army. So that goes against the picture we have, or at least the story that we've been told. Okay? Now, if we move on to previous military experience, I don't know if you can see this, but one of the arguments, again, made by the anti-treaty side, particularly by Tobin, who led the Army Mutiny in 1924 or thereabouts, was that the pro-treaty side had a lot more British soldiers, that half the anti-treaty, half the National Army were ex-British soldiers. And while the government was now retiring Republicans, the British Army was getting special positions in the Irish Army. So the new state was aligning with the British. It was giving superior advantages to the British side. So let's check pro-treaty. So former British service. We found, so Tobin argued that 50% of the National Army were ex-British, okay? We found that, in fact, only 16.5% of those who died had British Army backgrounds, who were in the National Army. So that was very interesting. It's far lower. We need to go back and revisit those figures, because the historians have bought Tobin's story hook, line, and sinker. A statement was made to that effect in the Dáil in 1926 by an ex-unionist, actually, who was saying, look, this shows how great the National Army is. They're all British soldiers. It's fantastic. And so historians have cited this as evidence, and of course it's not evidence at all. So we need to go back and look at that issue again. What about former IRA service? So what we found out was that actually more pro-treaty fought in the IRA than in the British Army. So we need to revisit this whole area. Of course, there was also 2.1 of the anti-treaty side had served with the British Army. Tom Barry, one of the leading guerrilla fighters in Cork, he had extensive experience in the British Army, so he knew all about doing ambushes. He didn't lick it off the ground. So if we move on to the next one, which is, I'm getting on to my conclusion now. So really, these figures generated here reveal that fatalities between June 1922 and May 1923 were somewhat lower than in the War of Independence. Previously, historians believed, wrongly as it turns out, that the Civil War was far worse than the War of Independence. And I think one of the reasons for this might have been that really mostly or almost all the people who died in the Civil War were from an Irish background. And of course they were killing each other, which is another thing that made it worse. Of course, many of the British who died in the War of Independence, we didn't know so much about them. But what we can see here is that the Irish Civil War was by no means more terrible than what had gone before. That is simply not borne out by the figures. Another defining feature of the Irish Civil War, if we compare the Irish Civil War to other conflicts in Europe at the time, was the relatively low level of civilian fatalities. And that's also a contrast with the War of Independence. There were much more civilian fatalities in the War of Independence, both spies and informers, suspected spies and informers, and many others shot by the British in roadblocks and so forth. So civilians were not targeted as much or much less in the Civil War than they were in the War of Independence. Over 3/4 of all fatalities were combatants. In a wider European comparative context, the Irish Civil War lacked a strong class dimension. So it didn't have a big left-right issue, like, for example, the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War, which followed. In the Russian Civil War, 3 million people died alone in Russia. It was incredibly violent. So Ireland just wasn't anything like that. It was much more moderate. or even say, for example, the Finnish Civil War, 35,000 people died in the Finnish Civil War. So the Irish conflict was nothing. It lacked the intensity of violence of Eastern Europe, Russia, Finland, and so on. But as I've already said, those who died were not simply a forgotten statistic. Each death had its own tragic family story. And this project has provided an overview. If we go back, and again, yeah, so at the back of the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, this work appears as a chapter in that, the analysis that I've been talking about. But at the back, you can see this is a list of all the names of each and every victim of the Civil War that we could find. So I see this as a beginning. This is a project which kicks off this investigation. And we have revealed many deaths that have been entirely forgotten, particularly civilian deaths. Obviously, Republicans commemorated their dead from the 1920s. Less so the National Army, actually, interestingly. The National Army shied away from commemoration until the last 20 years or so. Civilians were totally forgotten. And that's been one of the benefits of the decade of centenaries, is we're now considering all deaths. And that's the way it should be. And I would hope that this research facilitates family members, others with an interest in history, to uncover the full story of each and every one of these individuals we've identified here in Carlow and in other counties, so that they can be more fully explored and we can do justice to the memory of all the victims of the conflict. And it's only then that we can write the people's history of the Civil War and not just the political history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, for a most interesting lecture. And now we are open for questions, if there are any. I'm sure Andy will.
Sure, yeah.
That's great. So, do we have any questions? Jim.
I had various headings there of how people died.
Yeah.
I'm interested in how you decided which category they fitted. If you take, for example, the incident outside Macomb where the 8 soldiers were killed.
Yeah.
Depending on which side you were on, you could see that as killed in action or assassination murder.
Yeah.
If you take Ballyseedy,
Yeah.
it could be killed in custody or murder.
Absolutely, yeah. So these are things that we were tortured over. How do you can't categorize them into both, but we had to make decisions around it. So,
How did you?
well, okay. So let's go back to the table and we'll. Yeah.
Go again.
Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Right. So, assassination, murder. So, civilian. Well, killed in action would be those who died in combat. So, those who were killed in mine explosions, that would have counted. That we would have put them down as combat. So in the case of the Macroom killings, that's how they would have been listed. You know, that was. I suppose it was an act of war, in the sense that people were killed with those mines. Now, how do we do prisoners like at Ballyseedy? You know, that's a more difficult one. You know, so let me look at. Okay, IRA fatalities. Killed or fatally wounded in action. So, executed would be official executions, right? Those who were fired after a summary court decision in front of a firing squad. But someone who, an unofficial killing, would be assassinated. So I would say the Ballyseedy would be an unofficial execution. Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
My grandfather fought in an Irish regiment in the First World War, and he lived with us. And he told me he joined the army, the Irish regiment in the First World War, because they were promised home rule. So once he realised that they were betrayed, he came back to Belfast and he joined the IRA. And the only wound he got was in his arm from the roof of his house, shooting the forces, the British forces in Belfast. So it's very complicated, you know. Yeah, so that's why. That's basically why I'm up there. When they were told home rule, come and fight, we'll give you home rule. So that's what happened.
And they didn't get home rule, and he was in Belfast, and he joined the IRA.
He was in Belfast, but he joined the Leinster Regiment, the Irish Rifles Leinster Regiment, and he fought the First World War. He lived 4 years.
Yeah.
He came back, and they were very poor. He had a big family, very, very poor, so he had to go. Home rule was so when he came back and said he then joined the IRA because they were betrayed, you know?
Yeah.
He felt betrayed, and so he then fought with the Belfast regiments in the north. They got no wounds in the First World War, but he got wounds in houses and Falls Road in Belfast, fighting specials and police forces, and people who came in to do raids in the area for Catholics, you know? So it's very sad for people up north as well at that time. They had no rights.
No, it was a very difficult period in the north, particularly just before the Civil War. Like the numbers are very small here, but that's misleading because there were 500 sectarian killings in Belfast just before the Civil War. We start with the 28th of June. That's when we begin. Whereas in Belfast in the previous year, there'd been hundreds of these killings. More Catholics than Protestants, but also Protestants. But what way did he go with the? Did he go pro or anti-treaty, or was he involved with the Civil War?
I was young at the time, so I remember when he was talking to me because he shared a bedroom with me, you know. So I'm trying to understand it really through him.
Yeah. Have you seen his pension file?
You know,
But you're entitled, if you're a relative, you're entitled to see it, and you see it in the military archives, and that will tell you which way he went. Yeah, that'd be.
I presume he wanted. I presume he I'd imagine if he was on the IRA.
I wouldn't assume anything. I mean, that's what I would have assumed, but actually more fought from Northern Ireland with the National Army, which I thought was staggering. I couldn't understand that. But I think a lot of it came down to money. You know, people needed jobs. Soldiers, ex-soldiers, 50% of the ex-soldiers were out of work. They needed work, and this was work that they had a CV, they had a job experience. So they were eagerly signed up. Many were still wounded from the First World War.
You mentioned the Northerners, people from the North who joined the National Army. Presumably most of them came from a nationalist background. And the other aspect I'd be interested in, was there any sectarian analysis done of the casualties?
The people from the North would be more from a nationalist background for sure, but there was some unionists in the National Army who obviously joined for just purely for the cash. So there was some unionists who joined up. Sectarian analysis of the fatalities, we didn't do that. Like that would take a bit longer. So we didn't go down that route. You would, how would you? It's a tricky one. I suppose the 1926 census would be an obvious. You might be able to. You'd have to see the original returns, the household returns, which are just about to come out. You have a job. So I don't. You could go back to 1911 and look at the religion in the 1911s, but you'd have to trace every individual down to the household where they lived to see that. So you could get quite a lot of them, probably. What would it tell? What do you think it might be interesting about? Why would it be worth doing that?
Yeah, like, sorry.
It'd be a lot of work. So you'd have to have a good. You have to have a good reason.
You mentioned that your class analysis demonstrates that, you know, the Fianna Fáil claims that they represented working class or
Yeah.
men of no property doesn't stand up really to analysis if you analyze the casualties or fatalities
Yeah.
of the Civil War.
Yeah.
But of course, they would probably argue that they were fighting for the lower classes in society, whereas the National Army was defending status quo
Yeah.
with its present social hierarchy. You know, so
Yeah. No, I take your point, and I think the other thing is we're looking at the people who died. How people voted was a different question, and undoubtedly the electorate viewed it in a different way and came down, along more those kind of social lines you're talking about. But we're just talking about the people who died, and that it didn't fit that story, which probably stands up if you do an analysis of the electorate. So I take your point.
A more general question about the really people voted on and decided something. But the issue about swearing allegiance, the fact that it wasn't a public, it was state. How much, if at all, did the whole issue about the partition featuring the split between atrocities? My reading of things all about the fact that hello public and restoring allegiance to
Yeah, like I partition. I mean, they tried to argue for it, but at the treaty negotiations, it just didn't wash. It was a situation where the British had all the cards, and they argued they had a majority in the north. They obviously had an army that sealed off the border, and the Northern IRA really didn't have a chance in the north because they were outnumbered by 10-1 when you take into account the army, particularly when you take into account the police, and there was just no possibility of any kind of resistance in the north. So that's not answering your question. In the south, I think it came down to realpolitik. It was about taking what you could get, the pragmatic. I think there was a division between the Republican ideologues who just couldn't live with the idea of partition, that sold out what they had fought for since 1916. Whereas those who saw what was possible, and I think Collins was a bit like that. He kind of came in from the cold, and he said, "This is what's possible, and we take it or leave it, and this is an opportunity that we can take another step further down the tracks. Stepping stone. And so that was his view, and that many followed Collins. He had a huge influence within the IRA, obviously, particularly on the anti-treaty side. Many just followed him because he was Collins, you know. But I think that was important. I think overall, in many areas, partition wasn't a big issue. It wasn't a dominant issue in the discourse about what was at stake.
Okay, are we happy to, that concludes our questions for the evening. Thank you again, Andy, for answering those questions. And I'll now call on Paul to propose the defence.
Two-year-old glasses here.
Okay, I'll just say many thanks to Dr. Bielenberg for a very, very interesting presentation. The topic of the Irish Civil War has been well looked at in recent years as we pass through the 100th anniversary from 2022 to 2023. Your findings are a new view of things, which is really interesting. The figures related to the loss of life and the areas where loss of lives were highest is very interesting. Irish Civil War, when I was young, but it seemed to be glanced over in my childhood. I would have thought back then it was all about the 1916 Rising in the school books, and get one up on the Thames in the War of Independence, and all the great ballads, Wolfstones and Fury Rivers and so on. But the Civil War, which lasted, as you said, for 11 months, is small in comparison to the earlier Great War, World War I, which took millions of lives, including 38,000 Irishmen and some volunteer nurses. It was glanced over too in Irish textbooks, yet it took almost 1,500 lives, as Dr. Bielenberg mentioned. Many would have fought side by side in the Easter Rising of 1916, and then the war against the occupying Crown forces between 19 and 21, a year earlier to the Civil War. It might explain the footnote it had in Irish school books, and basically a footnote, because our greatest heroes of the time died by Irish-owned bullets, and all by occupying Crown forces. A few examples would include General Collins, obviously, Cathal Brugha, Liam Lynch, who died in battle, and Rory O'Connor. And then Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Joe McElvey, and Dick Barrett were executed by firing squad on the 8th of December. And our own Jim Lillis, also executed in Carlow Barracks in January 23. Dr. Bielenberg mentioned various Carlow people: Thomas Dunn, Dennis Hockney, Tom Keogh, who died was the senior officer who died in the mine explosion, which we discussed in September 22. Edward Byrne of the Free State, who died at Granny. Patrick Allison, who you mentioned, who also died at IRA site in Granny. Tom Nolan, who died in October 22. And Eamon Snoddy, you mentioned, and so on. So you covered everything in fairness to you. So I just want to say at the end, on behalf of the Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society, I'd like to propose a vote of sincere thanks for a very enjoyable and very interesting presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next lecture will be on the 19th of March, this month, at 8 p.m. here in the Seven Oaks Hotel. The title will be Landlords and Tenants in County Carlow, 1879 to 1960. And it will be delivered by Dr. Oliver Phelan. And Oliver, it's great to have you here with us this evening, and your wife. And many connections with Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society. So we very much look forward to that lecture on the 19th of March. Landlords and Tenants in County Carlow, 1879 to 1960. Gary and John are down there at the desk, and they have some Carlow present publications, and some backdated issues as well. And you're very welcome to maybe part with a little money and get one of those. And also to say that if you're wish to become a member, Kerry will also help you with that as well, to become a member of Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society. And we very much welcome that. There is no charge for tonight's lecture, but if you wish to make a donation, that would be gratefully received. So, thank you again for coming on this rather messy weather-wise night. Thank you again to Andy and to Linda for being with us here and coming up from Cork. And just once again, it's a great pleasure, particular pleasure for me, because the Bielenberg family live right beside where I live, and so our farm at home joins quite an extensive boundary with Money House, and he's going there tomorrow to see his father, Nicholas, and so it's good to see the connections that we have around. He mentioned that, and I think I've said this before, but he mentioned that while we live in County Wicklow, that part of the area is in County Wicklow. I was on Saturday. There was a hunt at Money House, and his sister Belinda was there, and one of the people at the hunt was she lives on the Carlow in County Clare, and she was saying how wonderful it was to be in this part of Wicklow, because it was so. I told her it was the back of Beyonds, but she said she liked it for being the back of Beyonds, and I suppose we do too. It's not really the back of Beyonds, but anyway, we live in County Wicklow. We have a postal address in County Carlow, and now we're in the constituency of Wexford. So you can't get much more confused than that. So again, Andy, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming tonight and a safe journey home. Thank you.